So on 26 January 1950, the Constitution of India was adopted formally and came into effect. Its preamble set out in brief the enlightened values it enshrined and hoped to engender. In a radical shift from mainstream constitutional history, this book establishes Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's irrefutable authorship of the preamble by uncovering the intellectual origins of its six most central concepts: justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, dignity, and nation. To the moderator's introduction, Dr. Vikas Jambulkar is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science, RTM Nagpur University for the past 17 years and more, and is presently heading the department. He has been actively engaged with both the administrative and academic work of the university and has published more than 25 papers in the national and international journals and books. He has also delivered more than 250 invited lectures in various national and international seminars, conferences, and workshops on various themes of political science and international relations. Moving on to the author's introduction, Aakash Singh Rathore is a frequent speaker and commentator on Indian politics, history, and constitutional law, and his work has been featured in numerous publications and media outlets. He is also known for his engaging and informative approach to the subject matter, making it accessible to a wider audience. He is passionate about bringing Ambedkar's ideas and contribution to the forefront of the public discourse, and his book is a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the true story behind the making of Indian Constitution. He is also known for his wit and sense of humor, which we all like, making his talks and lectures engaging and entertaining. He's the go-to person for a new perspective on the Indian Constitution and its maker, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. So without any further ado, and I'm sure we're very excited to get into conversation with both the moderator and author, may I please request the moderator to usher the author on stage, and let's have a huge round of applause and welcome the author.
Yeah, thank you, Arushi, for the kind introduction to both of us. Welcome you all readers to this very important session of the day. Let me welcome also Aakash Singh Rathore, on whose book Ambedkar's Preamble, A Secret History of the Constitution of India, which has been published by Vintage. We are going to discuss that book over here. And I will straightway go to Aakash, and who would like to begin, because I guess 35-40 minutes are going to be very less for this session. It's such a packed book that we have, right? So Aakash, you already have 8 books, 20 edited ones, 5 volumes of Ambedkar that you have already written. You have so many of your teaching assignments that you have done from Delhi University to various international universities, as well as fellowships, as well as you are also a triathlete, and you are the 3rd position in India. So that is a very tall order in a way, right? So do you think that is a necessity for you to keep you sane in a completely insane world?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I want to make a private joke that I thought someone was in the audience to see us, but he was here for his daughter. But so yes, I think this is a very difficult thing, because in fact I engage in a lot of different disciplines, theoretically, academically, but at the same time engage in things that are completely non-academic, unacademic. And in fact, I've suffered for it quite a lot. When I go into, for example, when I was teaching at Delhi University, when I would go into the office, I would hear some faculty members sort of laugh at me. Are you just coming from the gym? You know, suggesting that anyone who is interested in physical things must have no brain, right? And at the same time, when I enter into the gym, I encounter people who are exercising who laugh and say, oh, the philosopher has come. So both of these worlds are so opposite and antagonistic to each other. And I feel like that's how our world is characterized, by opposites and antagonisms. And experiencing both of them fully does allow me to be a little more satisfied in the way that our lives are full of contradictions and so on. It does help bring a little bit of sanity, but it creates its own problems also.
Yeah, I can understand, because these are two very different words that you are trying to integrate. I'll move on to the next thing, the title of the book that you have carried, and particularly the minor title, The Secret History of the Preamble, particularly. Right. So it immediately had come to my mind, is it an open secret or a secret secret, right? Because I'll contextualize it. Why I have framed this question precisely because post-independence, post-constitution, Ambedkar and Ambedkar's writings have been completely ignored, had been completely, in a way, what you can say, completely, there was a phase of indifference which was there, right? Second was the phase of resistance to his arguments. There was a big resistance within the population itself that resisted his ideas. And thirdly, there is a very reluctant acceptance of his ideas. So given all these three phases in which we have gone throughout the period, right, Ambedkar becomes a mystery to many, right? Whether he has spoken about this, whether he has written about this, whether he says this and that and all, you have to make an extra effort to prove it, rather than the society going and reaching out to Ambedkar, trying to make its own effort to understand what he has exactly said and how he meant about it. So, is it a secret history, right?
Yes, yeah. No, I think you're right. There's one thing I would add. I think we're in a fourth phase now. After the reluctant acceptance, although people are divided on this, for ordinary middle-class people, especially Savarna people, there's still the reluctant acceptance phase. But within elite institutions, government, academia, it's moved past reluctance to appropriation. Right. And now, you know, in 2011, I wrote in a preface to a critical edition of Ambedkar's Buddha about how the left had ironically ignored Ambedkar's works throughout post-colonial theory's glory. It was never once mentioned. Padma Chatterjee from the 80s was completely silent, but suddenly in 2004, he wrote 4 articles. You know, so silent for 25 years, and then suddenly wakes up, and now, I don't want to speak badly of him, he's just a symbol of the central figure of the movement of post-colonial theory. And now you won't find anyone within that movement who isn't working on a book on Ambedkar. And part of it is because government funding has gone to this, and academics, especially elite ones, privileged ones, go to where the money is. You know, this is a very sad thing. And so there's now an appropriative phase of Dr. Ambedkar, which I think is a little bit frightening, because I don't know what the 5th phase will be, you know, after that. I have a feeling that once those who are insensitive to the lived experiences of Ambedkar and the communities that he tried to represent, once they get their talons into it and become Ambedkar experts, the next thing is to start to deconstruct him and say he was wrong here, he was wrong here, and he was wrong here. So I fear that the next phase is going to be an anti-Ambedkar backlash. But let's see, we can be more optimistic, hopefully. And then I've already forgotten the second part, or the more central part of what you were asking. Oh, the open secret, yeah. So this is very, very, you know, insightful of you, because one of the first persons that I gifted the book to was Gopal Guru. And he looked at it, and he laughed, and he said, but we all have known this for a long time. Right. So why do you call it a secret? But the interesting thing is, why I wrote the book, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why one writes a book, but what really was the catalyst was a simple Google search in 2018, who wrote the preamble? And as I talk about in the introduction, there was many answers came, but none of them were Ambedkar. The answers were Nehru, B.N. Rao, the drafting committee ambiguously. None of them was Ambedkar. So one of the things that I'm proud about this book is now if you do a Google search, the answer is always Ambedkar. So all of those, the algorithm has changed as a result of doing this work. So yes, you're right, within the community, it has always been known, no secret about it. But outside of that community, in the dominant communities and Google algorithms and UPSC examinations and so on, it has always been unknown. And yes, so I feel happy to have brought that, what was already known to some, to a larger group.
Yeah, so in that way, the book makes a very important contribution into the literature of constitution making in India as well. To bring to the readers, the style of the book is very historical as well as philosophical. Most of the time when we are talking about the Constitution of India, we are basically talking from a juristic notion, we are talking from a legalistic notion. Nobody has dwelt it from a historical point of view. Nobody has dwelt it even from a philosophical point of view. Even for that matter, when Rajiv Bhargav complains that the Constituent Assembly lays down the foundation of a lot of political theoretical insights which has provided, but none of the work has come out of that caliber, right? So given this, why did you choose to bring it from history and through the whole philosophical discourse also within the subcontinent?
That's, okay. First of all, I'm nervous, so whenever I get nervous, I get boring. So let me try to wake up now.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. When courts pass judgments about what our Constitution means, they often go back and say, let's look at the minds of the draftsman, draftsperson. What were they thinking when they created this? And based on what they were thinking, we can determine what the law is. I had observed that judges had no idea who had written the preamble. Right. So how can you decide what was in the mind of the author when you don't know who the author is? Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, judges up to the apex court had been reading the preamble in a very unimpactful way. So not as a document that was meant to revolutionize India, but one that was simply meant to contain and control it. And so I felt that we need to go through the historical background of the personal and intellectual struggle of Dr. Ambedkar to see how much blood and sweat and tears went into the drafting of this preamble. So when judges say, what was in the mind of the draftsman, they will see that it was a very revolutionary thing that was in the mind, and consequently will be, held more accountable to not giving very banal, explanations of when we say liberty, this can be compromised for security. What would Dr. Ambedkar say about that? No, liberty is emancipation. It is not to be compromised for,
for the idea of security.
So this was basically the reason behind bringing the background, the historical background, into the present moment for the preamble, because what ought to be a very effective political tool had turned out to be more of a floor mat for judges.
Yeah. So that is what you have been talking about in the book as well, that the way the preamble got framed within the whole process of drafting it, Ambedkar chose very wisely how to place the words and what words to be selected and what words need not be selected within the preamble. And that is how he not only changed the center of gravity within the whole text, and brought the whole new meaning to it. And that is where I guess this whole historical philosophical context really becomes important. So I'll move ahead, and a very simple question in that sense. All the judicial proceedings we see that the judges have claimed that the preamble provides a prism through which we can read the text of the Constitution, right? you go beyond that. And you try to tell, look, this is the specific context within which the preamble needs to be understood, these specific concepts needs to be understood, and that's how the Constitution also needs to be understood. Can you throw some light on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it relates back to what I had just said. If we want to understand how the Constitution ought to be read to decide about questions of liberty versus equality, on questions of how much to balance economic versus social justice, things like this. We need to get some sense of the direction that the Constitution was meant to take, and that compass is the preamble. So in every case, the Constituent Assembly debates show that the Constitution is a product of compromise, but the preamble less so. The preamble is less a product of compromise. It is, of course, a product of compromise, but less so. It's more a product of passion and experience and understanding. So the Constitution needs to be interpreted in the spirit of the preamble rather than isolating the preamble as was done before the basic structure case. So it's, the passion in the preamble needs to extend to our understanding of the Constitution, and this is the basic motive behind the book.
Yeah, thank you for that. Aakash, you have, while classifying the preamble itself, you have divided it into 4 parts. One is the declaratory part, another is the objective part. The declaratory part is we the people of India, havingly solemnly resolved, and give to ourselves this Constitution. The objective part, which defines the governance structure of the polity. The descriptive part, which is what this book actually deals with it, the justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, dignity, and nation. The concepts, the governing principles becomes your descriptive part. So it's a very short question though. This descriptive part is the only part that you have dealt within this book. Or do we have to wait for another book to expect where you are going to explore the idea of the objective part as well as the declaratory part?
Yeah, I think, given more time on this earth, that would be something I would pursue, but there was a reason that I isolated the descriptive part, because we know that from the objectives that the idea is to create a sovereign, independent India. But what is the character of that India? The character, the point behind it, is found in the descriptive part. So, as a political philosopher, one has to ask a question which is in fact dangerous to ask, which is, do we need India at all? Do we need China at all? Do we need any state to which we belong? Personally, I would much rather be an anarchist. It's just completely impractical. But theoretically, why not be an anarchist? The state has to justify itself. Why does it exist? If the state is there to control, to surveil, to prefer, give certain people preferential treatment, to exploit, to tax and hold on to that wealth. If these are the functions of the state, then we're better off without it. But what the preamble does is it tells us why we have an India. And why do we have an India according to the minds of these draftspersons? In order to create justice, in order to have liberty, in order to have equality, in order to create a nation based on individual dignity. So we now have a standard by which to hold up, is India doing its job? Now, just to say, is India a sovereign republic? Well, yes, it is. So that's already there. That's the objectives part. So I have no quarrel with the objectives part. But what does it mean to be a democratic republic? It means to be a just, emancipatory, egalitarian one. And so that's why the heart of the preamble is in the descriptive part, and it also provides a tool according to which we can evaluate, especially as political philosophers, is there a point of India at all? Well, there sure is, if it is to be an emancipatory and just one. And if it's not to be, then maybe it needs some rethinking.
Yeah, thank you. So that itself becomes a point where we say that justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, dignity, these all becomes the principles for political obligation as well. That why do we obey the laws of the state? Precisely, this is because this state is supposed to provide all this kind of stuff. So that is where you are hinting at. So let us go into these concepts one by one. Justice, as you said, has been, as you have written in your book, you have not dwelt it through the conceptual lenses, but you see it through the lived experiences of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. Can you elaborate something? Can you throw light on this, that why it is not necessary to take a juristic view, but to take a lived experience view?
Well, because from the point of view of judicial review, juridical thinking, justice can be interpreted however any judiciary wants. But from the point of view of Dr. Ambedkar's lived experience, it has a very salient, significant, and poignant meaning. Mm-hmm. And his own life seems to have been a life lived rather justly. Mm-hmm. So there's also an exemplary aspect about it. And justice is supposed to be exemplary. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a universal concept with absolutely no detractors. Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard anyone say, I'm against justice?
No.
But you can say, I'm against reservation, which is to say I'm against equality, right? You can say I'm in favor of special detention, which is that you're against liberty. And you can say that, you know, there are many of these concepts we play around with, but justice is one that we don't. Mm-hmm. And yet anything can come under its cover. Mm-hmm. Why have our prisoners been not given bail for years and years? Because justice is, just working. Justice is slow or whatever it should be. So turning away from the concept in its abstraction, because it's a concept with which everyone claims to identify, mm-hmm. and turning towards what it would actually mean in a significant person's life, I think can be eye-opening for a lot of people. This is what it's supposed to mean: to pursue these things, to struggle to overcome, to make sacrifices for others, helping to lift them up, to make choices that are far more difficult and less procedural and self-interested. These are all things we see in Dr. Ambedkar's life. And I think they're the true meaning of what justice is and what it's meant to be in the preamble as well.
Right. I remember one article by Upendra Bakshi where he is trying to relate justice with emancipation, and that is where the emancipation of the most underprivileged section of the society, when they are emancipated, then that is where then justice happens. So that is where your book actually takes a detour of Dr. Ambedkar's life and tries to make a point that if these communities are brought into the forefront, if they are emancipated, then justice can happen. So it is through these lenses and through this perspective that justice needs to be understood. We'll move on to the second concept, and that's quite interesting precisely because it brings us closer, not go far in history, but brings us to the immediate history of the national movement, where Ambedkar is confronting Congress and is making parity with the Congress as well at some point or the other, right? Where Ambedkar would like to distinguish between the notions of freedom, Swaraj, but instead prefer the idea of liberty, right? So what is the nuance in terms of Ambedkar when he is talking about Swaraj?
Yeah, so I think this chapter was inspired by I don't want to say negative things, the unease that I had with reading who had written Righteous Republic? Ananya Vajpayee. Mm-hmm. Reading Ananya Vajpayee's Righteous Republic. The book is prefaced on the idea that the righteousness of the Indian Republic is grounded somehow in this idea of Swaraj, and that Swaraj is the concept that binds together all of our freedom struggles and the national movement and everybody who was involved of whatever political party. And yet, Dr. Ambedkar, the chapter that she writes on Dr. Ambedkar in that book doesn't mention the word Swaraj once. And I couldn't understand, how is it that when we speak of Swaraj, especially in relation to the nation and the national movement, Dr. Ambedkar is always swept under the rug, pushed aside. It happens in Gurpreet Mahajan's book on democracy. It happens in all of the standard works in political history. So I decided, let me understand what Ambedkar's ideas on Swaraj were. And I was surprised to find, I don't remember, I think I write in the book 250 occurrences of the word Swaraj in Dr. Ambedkar's writings. And yet, no one ever discusses this. But the reason is, as you mentioned, his idea of Swaraj was an extremely nuanced one. It was an idea that Swaraj refers to a kind of freedom to be won that will be recognized when no one is oppressed. So what difference does it make if my oppressor is an Englishman or an Indian? So Swaraj is not getting rid of the Englishman, it's getting rid of the oppressor. And if the oppressor, unfortunately, is the man sitting next to me, then I have no Swaraj if he's in power. So his notion of Swaraj was inconsistent with constructing a national narrative that our freedom and independence arrives when we get rid of the colonizer. Because for Dr. Ambedkar, and for many communities in India, the colonizers are right here amongst us. So the idea of Swaraj in Ambedkar forces us to look at ourselves rather than pointing the finger at the British and the others. And it's never easy to look at oneself.
Yeah, I can understand that because Ambedkar actually perceives the whole idea of freedom at two levels. One, the independence from the British Raj, as well as the independence from the caste society in which he finds himself at a very utterly helpless position. So let me read out a paragraph from your book. The long history of the national movement, the conceptual status of Swaraj within it, the mystification of the term freedom in relation to Swaraj, and the almost universal exclusion of the untouchables from the predominant understanding of both concepts, a phenomena which continues unabated in contemporary political and conceptual histories, were among the overarching factors that provoked Dr. Ambedkar to eschew those easy connotations in his newly conceived preamble. And I guess that catches the crux of it, that Ambedkar is so, in a way, careful in using the term both freedom or Swaraj in exchange to liberty. So he wants a completely different term to replace these terms within the Constitution. I'll bind up some of the concepts together, and we'll see. Equality has been one very important area which Ambedkar had a lot of way to cater to, and he wanted the Constitution of India to basically, and the state basically, to bring in this phenomena of equality. And you take a detour into revolution and counter-revolution, the track that Dr. Ambedkar wrote, to bring home the point that if for Hegel freedom is to which the history is marching, for Ambedkar history is marching towards equality. Can you please in a brief, you can explain that.
Yeah, well, that one is hard to be brief about because it's a book that was never published. In fact, I mean, each of you are probably somewhat familiar with how many books Dr. Ambedkar had written in addition to all of his speeches and all of the work that he had done otherwise in government and so on. But somehow, though sick, he was tireless. And in the very last 2 years of his life, he took upon himself one day to write a 7-volume history of India, in 7 volumes. This history wants to show two things at the same time. It wants to show against the Orientalist attitude that equality is not some Western concept. You know, we hear this all the time, that that because our the freedom fighters were all educated in the West, they brought home these ideas of liberty and freedom and equality and so on. So Ambedkar wanted to show that this is completely false. And at the same time, he wanted to explain that the conditions under which true equality would be achieved, because quite frankly, a constitution is not enough, nor is an independent and sovereign India. And so he attempts to show this by reconstructing India as a series of emancipatory movements, starting with Buddhism, and then a counter-revolution of a very forceful Brahminism that you find, for example, in the Dharma Shastras when Manusmriti comes. That then takes 1,000 years to be overturned. So Ambedkar's history is it's just unbelievable. I can't believe it is, it has never been published. I've been working on it for many years to bring an edition of the book out. The idea is that all of India's history is characterized by a struggle for equality. That's precisely what we know India to be. It starts as a struggle for caste and gender equality through the Buddhist revolution against Brahminical Hinduism. And then it evolves through time, trying to face a counter-revolution. The counter-revolution happens at three levels. One is a political one, when Pushpamitra Shunga takes over the Mauryan Empire, which was a Buddhist empire. And legally, when the Manusmriti is written. And ideologically, through texts like the Mimamsa texts and some of the Brahmanas and so on, that kind of universalize the ideology of Brahmanism. So when we have, in 1950, let's say, a new political status, so it's canceling that counter-revolution of Pushpamitra Shunga. So we no longer have a Brahminical state. We have a democracy, India. When Dr. Ambedkar finalizes the constitution, that's why he's called the modern Manu sometimes, because this replaces the Manusmriti. So we have now overcome the counter-revolutionary political and legal movements that had happened in the ancient world. And yet one very important thing remains, which is the ideological. Because although we are a free and independent India with a constitution that is liberal and egalitarian, ideologically we are all still immersed in the hierarchies of old. And so our history is not yet finished. And so that's why it's this 7-volume project that he has. From the beginning, India has been a struggle for equality. And just because we have achieved equality in the political and the legal doesn't mean that we don't have a long history yet to come of trying to achieve equality at the ideological level. And I mean, it's a masterpiece. I think it's one of the most important books of the 20th century, without question.
That is also reflected in his 25th November speech, where he is talking about the contradictions.
Yes.
Where he says that though we have got political equality, we do not have social as well as economic equality to which the nation must strive. Right, so this is what the objective he would like to move ahead with, and that's the responsibility upon the state. I will take up this last question and bind up all the three concepts together. The idea of nation, and to which Dr. Ambedkar says that it is dignity, which is the first thing, which is a binding factor, and fraternity. So these are the two concepts. So one, that I should feel connected to each other. If I consider you as my brother and my kith and kin, it is only in this context that a nation can be brought in, right? A nation can be formed. It cannot be divisive. So that is where he says that castes are anti-national because they divide people, right? And then there is this another concept of dignity, which he tries to bring it before the very idea of nation itself, that every individual needs to be treated with dignity as every other individual would like to be treated himself, right? So moving it from the governance parlance where people were dignified in terms of office, he makes it an egalitarian principle to be applicable to each and every individual. So this is his take on nation. Please, can you reflect on these three triological principles that he brings forth?
Yeah, well, they're internally related, as everybody knows from the text of the preamble, the fraternity clause. Fraternity assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity. I leave out the 42nd Amendment change, the unity of the nation. So fraternity assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity of the nation. So these three concepts are closely linked together. What's fascinating is, as I described in the book, that one of the first objections to the fraternity clause was that it should read fraternity so as to ensure unity of the nation and the dignity of the individual. And Dr. Ambedkar got so agitated at this, and of course then the famous explanation, we will not have unity in the nation until we have the dignity of each and every individual. Right. So the priority of dignity over unity, in the lexical priority, in the way that it's written, is of such fundamental importance to the way we ought to understand two things, fraternity and the nation. So if you want unity in this nation, then we must exercise fraternity, or as I prefer to say, following Kalpana Kanabiran, queer sororal fraternity. So we don't gender this idea of fraternity. So national unity is premised upon the dignity of each individual, right, which can only be possible under a regime of queer sororal fraternity, where we recognize each person's dignity. And the importance of this is, possibly this is possibly the very essence of the preamble, and if I'm right in the way the book comes out, that means it is the essence of the Constitution.
Constitution itself. Yeah, thank you very much, Aakash. And I guess there's a lot of insights that are there. This book is loaded with a lot of references. This book is loaded with a lot of anecdotes. It is exhaustive in one way because it takes the whole breadth of history in one stride and also tries to explain the philosophy behind it. You may agree, you may not agree. Aakash is quite inviting. This book is quite inviting in terms of reading. You may have your own response in form of a book. But right now, let's take up some questions. We can ask some questions now.
Hello. I'm sure everybody wants to ask some questions. Can I have some hands, please?
They talk about Constitution being a compromise, right? And one of the things, I'll take a small example, where the American Constitution had 3/5 voting rights for the slaves, emancipated slaves, and it took them about 50, 60, 70 years to get rid of that compromise through and make it in line with their Declaration of Independence, where all men are created equal. Now we have a preamble, and the contradictions like 377 or 370 and a lot of others are contradictory. How do you see the current struggle where various stakeholders are trying to change and get rid of those contradictions over time? How does that play out in your mind?
Well, you've pointed out one of the contradictions that preoccupies us, but you also mentioned that in the American Constitution, it took them many decades to get it in line with the Declaration where all men are created. But I have a problem with that declaration because why does it say men, right? So as opposed to persons. So this is a task that does not stop. Each generation realizes another corner of iniquity and injustice and attempts to address it. But it needs some guiding light according to which to address it. And the preamble functions as that guiding light. As annoying as various current experiences are for each of us, at least we have an understanding that the preamble is where we are supposed to be going. The idea that it should happen today or tomorrow or even 20, 30, 40 years from now, I don't think history has ever shown that anything happens in a straightforward evolutionary process. There are always turns, directions, and so on. But we're fortunate to have that guiding light. So I remain optimistic as long as the preamble is not tampered with.
Any questions? Yeah, over there.
Hi Aakash, hi Vikas. This is Prashant Ingoli from IIT Gandhinagar. Actually, I happen to be here accidentally, but it's good to listen to you. I have two questions, actually two questions, but I'll ask only one. Is that, as you mentioned, Baba Saheb as a modern Manu, I think it was Dhananjay Keer, who is in Baba Saheb's biography, calls him as a modern Manu. So how feasible it is to call him as a modern Manu? Okay. Right? Because he was also pragmatic and egalitarian person in that way, looking for equality. And if we refer him as a modern Manu, are we not referring back to Manu Smriti as well?
Yeah. To be honest, that I find that characterization quite offensive, the modern Manu. But I'm just acknowledging that it exists and trying to appropriate that phrase, which is rather offensive, into Ambedkar's own framework, because Ambedkar himself saw the Constitution as being an overturning, a counter to the counter-revolution of Manu. So I fully agree with what you're saying, and I think that might be the first time I ever used the expression in public, and I already regret it.
Yeah, please. Yeah, please hold it.
I'm Kerman. I wanted to ask you, what is your take on the Uniform Civil Code?
Okay.
Well, I have very similar feelings about it, perhaps not surprisingly, as Dr. Ambedkar had. There are times when I think we'll be discussing this in a future session about left and right. There are times when we may have to to defend things that we don't necessarily agree with in order to protect something else. And that's basically how I feel. To be honest, I don't want to answer your question, but let me go ahead and see if I insult everyone that. So as a lawyer, I'm also a lawyer. I'm more into political philosophy and so on. But as a lawyer, I don't understand anything other than a uniform civil code. As a lawyer, but as an Indian in a social context, I will always fight for preventing articulations of the logic of uniformity that risk the dignity and the sensitivity to communities that are at risk. And so as a consequence, while my legal mind, like Dr. Ambedkar, would prefer some uniform code, my social mind realizes that maybe we need to protect something else instead of just going for rational legal system. I tried to say it as gently as I could.
Hello Aakash, Abhishek from Rathore.
Hi Abhishek.
Thank you for dwelling into such an historical aspect of the Constitution. A little academic question which could be boring for some people, but my question is about the very idea of inclusion, which I think to be very paternal and patronizing. You talked about Professor Guru. Professor Guru, day before yesterday, on the 20th anniversary of his article, very well celebrated EPW article, how egalitarian are the social science of our country, where he asserts or where he argues that the academy of our country is still very discriminatory in a nature that, while arguing about it, he categorizes it as theorizing Brahmins and the empirical Shudras, as the Brahmins as the oppressors and the Shudras as the oppressed people of the, in the social system of our country. That is it. Where the theorizers tend to appropriate the lived experience of the Shudras. We see that the theorizers have tried to appropriate the
Kindly keep ask the question.
Please make it short.
Do you think this appropriation and inclusion has gone to an extent that it has completely overshadowed the idea of assertion per se? That this inclusion and assertion debate is going on?
Abhishek, I think that's a very complicated question. So first of all, I have to disagree with the very first thing you said about inclusion as being patronizing and so on. As I had tried to explain yesterday, I don't know if you had heard, inclusion is not an act of a sovereign individual to allow you to be included. Inclusion is a process by which I become more fully human, more fully who I am, by the gesture of recognizing my incompleteness without others. And so to say that inclusion is a product only of sovereign decision makers is to completely misunderstand what inclusion actually is, because inclusion is an everyday experience for all of us, even though we're not all IAS officers or whatever. So I just want to give that caveat. Secondly, there's something very sad about the fact that Gopal Guru has to, 20 years later, say the same thing he said 20 years ago. You know, that's not right. So if that's the case, if 20 years later he finds that the problem is the same as he had identified, in one of the most brilliant pieces written in that era, right, by a social scientist, which was supposed to be a wake-up call. There were hundreds of seminars and conferences about that piece, and yet 20 years later, nothing has changed. So that tells you the ineffectiveness of maybe these conferences and seminars and so on, which probably tells you more about the strong hold that inegalitarian elites have on our academic spaces. But assertion is a different phenomenon. Assertion is a grassroots, ground-up thing. And thankfully, most people who are in that business don't listen to academics like us. They have more important things to do. So I don't think there's a correlation between appropriation and assertion necessarily, because it's an autonomous, thankfully, an independent space that has its own energy. In fact, we learn from it every day, I think.
That's a perfect answer for that question. So we're short on time, and as you have to be in a panel right next door. So let's conclude this session, and thank you so much to everyone for coming and gracing us with your wonderful smiles, and thank you. Let's have a huge round of applause for the author and the moderator.
Could I say just one thing?
Yes.
Thank you very much,
yeah.
and thanks to the moderator.
Thank you, Aakash.
The book is much better than how I presented it.
So that's the sense of humor we were waiting for. So I just want to also let you know the book is on sale at Crossword downstairs. So please buy the book and read, and you can also converse with our author at his convenience only, if I may say so. Without further ado, we want to present you with a token of our love. So there is Suhasya Telang, who is an artist from Alag Angle community. He's made a one-of-a-kind painting just for you. Thank you, everyone.